I think Seymour Hersh specifically, I think Seymour Hersh is a national treasure. I mean, from the My Lai massacre, he's an extraordinary guy. I do think he's getting a little too old and a little too faithful in the competence of our imperial overlords. If you think about what Seymour Hersh, that story he put out there, is actually kind of a compliment to the United States. This idea that like, oh, of course, and then at the Naval War College, there's a special group. I'm not sure. I'd like it like there's a special.
Cool, right?
It sounds amazing. It's this like Tom Clancy fantasy. Yeah. It's like no, like some Ukrainian oligarch was able to put together a team of folks to go blow this thing up. Like that I believe more than I believe Hersh's very elaborate tale of U.S. competence. I have zero faith. After the past 20 years, I have zero faith in the competence of sort of the U.S. intelligence community.
But you're kind of implying that the competence has declined, right? Like, would you assume that there was a time where U.S. could have pulled that off?
No. I don't see so I'm writing a book right now called American Empire, the First 100 Years. And it's really extraordinary what a bunch of Keystone Cops, that's a very old reference, what a bunch of lunatic idiots have been running the U.S. National Security establishment like forever. We have had some very capable people at the State Department. I actually think George H.W. Bush, or maybe it's just the absolute clown car of people that's followed him, but the first Bush, who was in charge from 89 to 93, does seem like he really did seem to know what was up and have some ideas. Nobody since, but the vast majority of like the Cold Warriors were idiots.
I mean, where to start? Losing the nuclear bomb in the late 1940s, the non-existent missile gap of the 1960s, propping up the British and French empires for decades, quite rightly making the global South angry at us. The horrific abortion that was everything around Vietnam policy from the 1940s to the 1970s, turning vaguely left-wing politicians in South America and Africa into martyrs over and over again. I mean, really, the biggest success stories you can point to are the CIA's managing to overthrow the government of Iran in 1953 and Guatemala in 1954. And history shows that those were both tremendous own goals, giving birth to the Islamic Republic of Iran and pretty much destroying Guatemala as a functional country, which has ramifications on our border to this day. Oh yeah, and our super cool policy that defeated the Soviets in Afghanistan in the 1980s and only cost us a 9/11. Our Cold Warriors specialized in inflating threats everywhere and overreacting to them in ways that gave the Soviet Union a much longer lease on life than it deserved.
Okay. I maintain that the United States won the Cold War in 1956. The Soviet Union was over as a serious challenge to U.S. hegemony.
I was gonna push you on that, especially the 2 points coming to my head at the same time. One is you mentioned earlier that the serious threat was Germany and Japan, and you actually just skipped over the Soviet Union. So first of all, I find that interesting because I'd probably agree to some extent. Is the Soviet Union like a bit of a boogeyman that never actually represented the threat that was made out to be? But then second of all, it's like, if they're so incompetent, how come it is the most successful empire? Would that mean that everyone else is even more incompetent, or what is actually then driving this exceptional success?
We have a continent.
Okay.
We have a continent. Like our national territory is a continent. If every little piece of,
But so is Russia.
But Russia's
Soviet Union.
Like, is it though? Like, if you look at Russia, like functional Russia, it's sort of like a rim on Europe. And then there's a lot of territory that they were able to hold on to because nobody wanted, and then they had nukes when people discovered things they actually wanted in that territory. The United States is a continent. The United States has inertia. The United States was able to benefit from 30 years of European suicide in the world wars. We were just put into such a advantageous position, remain in such an advantageous position. And there are brilliant people in the United States. in the government very, very occasionally, but in terms of economics, in terms of business, in terms of society, in terms of it is an incredibly vibrant, I love my country, an incredibly vibrant place, but more importantly also of massive population and wealth, that weird combo of being able to be spoken of in terms of population terms of not at the same scale, but in kind of the same class as India or China or Indonesia, yet also having wealth levels comparable to, say, the Netherlands. I mean, that is an incredible historic anomaly that is fed upon and just sort of increases by the fact that we have a continent, that we were put in this space of world leadership almost inadvertently in 1917. I did just want to finish that thought. So the Cold War was over in 1956. It was the absolute bloody-minded idiocy of most of the Washington, D.C. establishment that kept the Soviet Union limping along until 1989, until 1992. I mean, Vietnam is just this incredible own goal, utterly pointless, utterly savage, utterly destructive. And it's funny, something I realized recently.
Just before we move on, what happened in 1956 that marked the potential end of it, and how they did they actually keep the Soviet Union alive? Literally, did they actually finance the Soviet Union to some extent to keep going?
People make that argument. I haven't delved into that argument, and I think it's probably a little too right-wing loony bin that the United States was actually bankrolling the Soviet Union at a certain point. I don't know. I haven't parsed those claims, but the Soviet Union as an serious, terrifying international entity was absolutely a creation of the United States. The Soviet Union won World War II, 100%. I'm not one of those people who would ever try to minimize the incredible sacrifices that 20 million Russians died or something, just unimaginable numbers. They were the victors of World War II, but they were bankrolled by the United States. The terrifying Red Army, the capacity, the power that allowed the Soviet Union to be a serious competitor to the United States in the post-World War II era up until 1956 or so was a creation of U.S. policy to crush Germany and Japan. Again, not minimizing at all the incredible sacrifices. They did the fighting. They are the people who destroyed the Nazis, but they did it with U.S. sponsorship. And that created a situation where the U.S. kind of felt like it had no choice but to acquiesce in this vast Russian empire across Eastern and Central Europe. We had no choice but to acquiesce in their relationship with Chinese actors that ended up taking over the country, which was very terrifying for us. Korea was a real thing. I'm very anti-U.S. wars, but it does seem in books I've read on the conflict that Stalin was all right, let's shoot our shot. Let's see if we can actually spread communism by gun. And I think there probably was real value in the United States stopping that. After that was stopped, so the Soviet Union's power was rooted in the incredible material support and just the fact that they were, Europe was destroyed and they were the people on the ground who could take it over. They were also aided by incredible ideological weight, incredible impressiveness to the entire global South that was very much not. There's this idiotic YouTube channel that talked about and European empires all ended in 1945 because they decided it was a bad thing to do, which is a tremendous misrepresentation of what actually happened. European empires ended in 1980 or 1992, depending on whether you go with Rhodesia or South Africa, and was still a very open question well into the 70s, whether European elements were going to hold on to empire in Africa, that sort of thing. So in that context of decolonization, the Soviets looked like a much more credible ally against these European empires and the United States that had stepped into 2 world wars to save those European empires.
Consider that contrast for a second. The Soviets were the liberators, the guys who beat the Nazis, the guys who were talking about spreading the wealth and bringing power to the masses. The Americans were the guys who were propping up the French and British empires and white supremacy in Africa. And it was pretty hard to deny the continuity between British and U.S. business interests. The Soviets used this in their propaganda throughout the Cold War. For the Russians, the U.S. and its allies weren't just greedy capitalists, they were imperialists as well. And in the beginning, the global South, what we used to call the Third World, bought this story.
In 1956, the Soviets completely blew up their credibility as an anti-imperial actor by rolling the tanks into Hungary at the exact same time as Dwight Eisenhower, God bless him, a guy who committed many crimes, but also did a few incredibly intelligent things. Basically told so in 1956, Israel, France, and Britain didn't like Nasser, the leader of Egypt at that time, cooked up an invasion. And did what they'd always done.
Is that the Suez crisis?
Yes, that's the Suez crisis. Went in and took it, and Eisenhower, in one of those rare, brilliant moments that are usually the most victorious moments in U.S. history, U.S. empire history, whatever, are the points at which somebody like Roosevelt or Eisenhower goes like, "Hey, that'd be dumb. Let's not do that." Yeah. And that's the point when Eisenhower said to France and Britain, and Israel, "Fuck no, we're not doing this."
I remember reading about this, yeah.
When he did that, contrasted with the Soviet Union rolling tanks into Hungary, Egypt, of course, ended up having a falling out with the United States, and we fell back into sort of a variety of pathologies and whatnot. But simply saying, no, actually, the era of empires is done. So in 1956, the Soviets entirely undermine their anti-imperial case. The United States, in one of our brief flashes of brilliance, underlines our own anti-imperial case. And then a lot of the momentum that the Soviets had from World War II begins to dissipate. The fact that their economic system was always impracticable, begins to wear. It was not a serious threat to the United States. You can probably...
Just like you would argue BRICS is not going to be.
No. To finish a thought, we're talking about Europe. The euro was a serious rival to the United States. That has dissipated. The idea that the BRICS are going to put together some kind of currency that, they've added Argentina. That's sure to bring, fiscal stability. The fact that Europe couldn't do it, a geographically contiguous territory of mostly developed countries that have very similar ideas as to how international currencies and financial markets should work. The fact that they couldn't do it, and the idea that BRICS is going to do it, I briefly had some credibility in the post-Ukraine oil spike, but they've got all these commodities, and that's important. Russia and South Africa. So perhaps some kind of commodities-based currency, but the swiftness with which the commodity crunch has dissipated makes all that look pretty illusory.
Well, in one way, I could salvage my argument with the plateauing empire is that we'd kind of our views on this would probably converge because the globe is kind of an upper limit. Right. So if you're consolidating power on the globe, you kind of are forced to plateau because you can't except we're going to have space conquest soon. But
there's no zero-sum game though. There's no the potentials within our globe, and yes, beyond it, are infinite for human development, for economic development. There's no zero-sum game here, and I think that folks who imagine that there is some kind of geopolitical game, some kind of a fight of rivals, this sort of thing, are kind of missing reality. It just doesn't exist. That's the fundamental nature of empire that the British Empire and the U.S. Empire share, is that we had the globe. We have the globe. We've had the globe since 1917. The British had the globe after 1815. And what you do with that can be miraculous, can be extraordinary. I think that there really was a moment. I'm writing this book, American Empire, the First 100 Years, and my chapter on the 2000s, I'm doing a chapter on each decade, is Murdering Utopia, the George W. Bush years. I really do believe in the 1990s there was a possibility for a U.S.-led, rules-based international order that just did extraordinary things for human flourishing. We saw some of those possibilities in China's rise, and I think, unfortunately, that moment is over, and people are thinking in more reductive terms of like, oh, it's about territory and geographical limits. It's so not, and it so didn't need to be. And it's like that kind of thinking that I don't do enough to talk against on my channel, but I'd like to do more.
If you enjoyed that conversation, you can check out all 2 hours of it over at Sean McFadden's YouTube channel by clicking on the link here. And I'd also like to welcome all the new subscribers. If you like my work, why not check out my Patreon page? We've got a Discord server and 2 exclusive streaming events every month just for the patrons. The next patrons-only newscast is coming up this Sunday, and there's still time to sign up.